Thank you, everybody who is joining us tonight. We're very happy to welcome all the viewers. This is a new format for us, but we're very excited that we were able to put this together. It's our traditional Cultural and Literary Salon of the Southeast European Film Festival. My name is Vera Mijojlic. I'm the founder and director, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome and thank a great panel of experts that we have in conversation tonight. We will have them introduce themselves in a minute, but before that, I would like to ask our gracious host, Denise, who's working with SEEFest, a few housekeeping notes.
Hello and welcome to SEEFest's first online event for SEEFest 2020. Thank you for being here with us tonight. In a few minutes or a minute or two, I will turn over the floor to our moderator and panelists. First, I would just want to let you know that if you have questions for the panelists, we'll be asking those questions at the end, but you'll see at the bottom of your screen that there is a button for Q&A. And if you could please use the Q&A to type in your questions, that will be the best way to get them in front of the panelists when we get to the end of their discussion. There's also a chat which you can participate in with your fellow audience members, and but for questions, please use the Q&A. And we will be asking taking questions at the very end. I think I said that. And with that, I turn the floor over to Nina.
Hello, everybody. I'm so pleased that we were able to connect despite the circumstances that we're in. But I want to thank Vera first and foremost for this opportunity to engage with such fascinating intellectuals. And I very much look forward to tonight. And yes, I hope that we can replicate the organic discussions that usually occur at the salon, but we will do our best. So I would first like to ask all of the participants to introduce themselves, just say a few words about yourself, as well as how this year's theme relates to your work, your field, okay? We can begin with Professor Shafer, perhaps.
Oh, hi, thank you. And I want to thank Vera for inviting me again to participate in the salon. I had a lot of fun last year with Nina and with Tom on the panel. It was a great event. So thank you very much. And thank you as well to Denise for organizing this, and welcome Julia for joining us this year. So my name is David Shafer. I'm the chair of the history department at California State University, Long Beach. I'm a specialist in French history. So why am I here speaking about Southeast Europe? I have a secondary interest in the history of Yugoslavia to a certain extent. And in addition to that, my work has now evolved into issues of identity. Not so much collective identity, but individual identity. And that's something that we'll explore later, so I won't really get into that right now.
Perfect. And then Professor Harrison, perhaps you can follow. I think you're muted.
Yes, I was muted.
Yes.
To be on the safe side, I said, hello, thank you all for participating, keeping us company in these dire times. I'm a professor of Italian at UCLA, and I work on transcultural connections, crossovers mainly of ideas from one place or time to another, but these can also be interconnections within the humanities, philosophy and the arts, or from one art to another, like painting and music. One of my studies discusses the expressionistic climate of Middle Europe in the years before the First World War, a period that gave anxious and perhaps even desperate attention to the breakdown of communities and the rise of subjective alienation that's witnessed by the burgeoning of sociology and Freudian psychology and visual arts of Vienna and music, and even the speculations of the young Hungarian Georg Lukács. Another example of my interest in this theme, the boundaries of belonging, lies in a new book I've prepared for press, actually should come out within half a year, which is called Bridges. This book takes bridges as a symbolic connection across a divide, reminding us that borders imply bonds no less than divisions, relationships with another culture or community, from which one distinguishes one's own. In Southeastern Europe, since that's our geographic perimeter, these relationships have probably been more present to mind than most parts of the globe, because they have had for centuries to negotiate radically different cultural forces, like the Ottoman Turks and the Orthodox Greeks, the Slavic Europeans of the East, and the Western empires and states of Italic or Germanic origin. This book bridges then, ranges from the constructions of ancient Romans to 20th century novels of Ivo Andrić and the Albanian Ismail Kadare, to the destruction of bridges in Mostar and other parts of Europe in the 1990s. I would add on to that after the Me Too movement, I thought of offering a course at UCLA which would treat comic cinema in Italy on gender and regional relationships between men and women. These comedies that I'm teaching currently are largely spoofs on Italian masculinity in a period of sexual liberation for women, to which the men are having a hard time adapting. What are the boundaries within which identities like male and female operate? How are those boundaries established by cultural narratives? How solid are those identities and the narratives that plead their case? Those are the kinds of questions I think that any good comedy raises. And so if we have time, I might even show you a tiny little clip from one of those films by Federico Fellini.
Excellent, thank you so much. And then we have Professor Koerner.
Yes.
Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I would like to introduce myself and share my screen with you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I'm originally from Austria, and I have a company in Austria, in Salzburg, which focuses on 3D printing in products and architecture and design. And I'm an assistant adjunct professor here in Los Angeles at UCLA. And my work looks in design. I'm a designer, and I have worked with Ross Lovegrove in London, and bridges into various different disciplines such as architecture, installation design, and I'm also extremely interested in fashion design, and I have specialized myself in looking into digital fabrication techniques and how those can essentially transform and rethink fashion design. I have also collaborated with other designers, for example, with Iris van Herpen in 2012, 13, and 14 for Paris Haute Couture collections. And in my own collections, I look into how we can kind of improve materials and how we can evoke characters and change the way of how we think designs are being produced. I also look into soft materials and how we can 3D print with soft materials. Most recently, I researched technologies such as how we can 3D print on textiles with multicolor. And most recently, I've been invited to collaborate with Ruth E. Carter on the costumes for the Black Panther Marvel movie for the Queen Ramonda. And I think this is also one of the reasons I was invited, and thank you so much to Denise and Vera and Nina and David and Thomas to have me today in the panel to speak more about how we can create identity. In my case, I will most likely speak a lot about the visuals we can create and how we can evoke new ideas about innovative ways how to rethink, how to design characters and cultures, essentially.
Perfect, excellent. Sounds like we'll have a very rich discussion today. And I just realized I did not introduce myself, so I will just say that I am a UCLA student. I am a doctoral candidate at UCLA in the Department of Italian, and I am originally from Slovenia, but I grew up in Italy. So I'm very interested in questions of borders, individual identity, collective identity, boundaries of belonging. And I think this theme is very interesting, and we can approach it from so many different aspects, and you guys all show that. So I will dive right into my first question, which is for Professor Shafer. So as you probably know as a historian, the Italian thinker Benedetto Croce believed that all history is contemporary history, suggesting that historical analysis consists in filtering the past through present concerns and issues. So my question is, do you agree? And conversely, if history is continually invoked in and by the present, how does it shape our understanding of contemporary identity?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. So Croce's point, I'm seeing something. Oh, you've got Croce on there. Okay, never mind. So Croce's point is that basically, as you said, we're filtering an analysis of the past through present concerns. And that's been a recurring theme, obviously throughout history, is that we are influenced by the present, and oftentimes we gravitate towards a historical subject because of present concerns. So, for example, if I could give the French Revolution as an example, the historiography of the French Revolution had typically seen it for probably a century and a half as a class struggle, as a rising bourgeoisie against a declining nobility. Then we fast forward to the post-World War II era. In the post-World War II era, our concerns were East against West. The Western world against the Eastern world. The Eastern world basically meaning the Soviet Union and satellite states, and liberalism versus communism. And so R.R. Palmer, a historian at Princeton, wrote a book about the age of the Democratic Revolution. And we talked about the French Revolution as being part of three revolutions: the Glorious Revolution in England at the end of the 17th century, the American War of Independence, and the French Revolution. And it was about ideas, in other words. It wasn't about class conflict or class struggle. But you can see where the times influenced his approach, influenced his perspective on a historical event. And then since then, of course, historians oftentimes take different movements. For example, women had been written out completely out of the narrative of the French Revolution until until about the 1980s, 1990s, late 1980s at the earliest, and then into the 1990s. Now, why were women suddenly, and I'm using scare quotes here, why were women suddenly discovered? Well, they were discovered because there had been a consciousness of women's roles in the past and their absence from any sort of discussion. So again, it's not just in terms of one's analysis of the past, but it's also in terms of one's perspective on the past and growing that perspective. With respect to your second question, you were asking, I'm sorry, could you repeat that again, Nina? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so conversely, contrasting the first part of my question, if history is continuously invoked in and by the present, can we ever really escape history? Or how does it shape our understanding of contemporary identity? So does the past play a role in how we understand ourselves today?
Yeah, yes, it does. And it also influences how we see ourselves today. Look, the past has some sort of a legitimizing impact, just by virtue of the fact that it actually happened. And the fact that it happened does create a sense of wanting to connect with that past, either connect with it or distance oneself from it. Either way, it has an influence, whether you want to be part of the continuum of the past, whether we're talking about the US Constitution and the constant evoking of these dead white guys from the late 18th century and what they created, and a world we live in today that they could never even have imagined that, or again, wanting to distance ourselves from a past that doesn't make us comfortable.
Okay, excellent. I think this raises this naturally leads to my next question for Professor Harrison, which is, you look at so many different forms of art, and you are always, as a student who's been in your class as well, always very sensitive to issues of identity. So my question is, what role does representation play in the production of identity? Does art influence how we think of ourselves in relation to the world? I think you might be muted.
Yeah, demuted. Yeah, representations of our identity are churned out every day in innumerable forms in elementary classrooms as well as university humanities courses, in advertisements, in social media. in politics that teaches us what it means to be an American, or that we should be first an American, second a citizen of the world, or that only some of us are properly American. Art, yes, it does play a crucial role, but not as much as it used to. That would be a provocative thesis I'd like to put out there, because until the rise of newspapers, print media, art was the media. That is, what it meant to be a Greek was established by people like Homer and storytellers who had folk wisdom to go on, and the stories that stuck. What it meant to be a Persian for a Greek was established by the dramatists, Aeschylus, and so on. Now, with the rise of newspapers and a more popular culture in the 19th century, art in that sense has become less and less important as an establishment of identity, to the point where now our popular arts are multiple. We've got tons of them, from a whole array of songs to TV performances, in which Beyonce and more Beyonce will demonstrate what it means to be a woman. And when it comes to the verbal arts, that is the ones that interest me the most because I'm literary, poetry, stories, and novels, which are read less and less, they also are more problematic because they're more sophisticated. That is, they tell rather than show, they analyze rather than demonstrate. The verbal arts represent identity, but also question it. And so that more complicated level of art is not the same as mere propaganda or images on the social media. It's something that engages the viewer in a cerebral, conceptual way. So the answer is yes, it does, but we'd have to establish exactly what art is in its essence, or in what way that art is operating today.
And Professor Koerner, perhaps you might be able to shed some light on that, especially coming from, a field where visuals are very important. So I would like to talk about Black Panther and your work on that film, and your 3D printed costume designs help to give an identity, help to give a collective identity to the fictional nation of Wakanda. Can you talk a little bit about the process, the behind the scenes process that we don't get to see and that we're not a part of, but that is endlessly fascinating, I'm sure. So can you talk about what kind of conversations lead to that, to the creation of such important visual artifacts?
Yes, sure. So when Rufi Carter and the director of the movie wanted to kind of create the visuals and the kind of identity for the Queen Ramonda character, essentially they thought that Wakanda is such an advanced and forward-thinking technology advanced fictional place that they really wanted that the queen herself in her regal attire kind of represents that advancements in technology. And so it came into their mind to kind of think about what advancements in technology in design actually mean, and how could they create something which hasn't been before, and how they could elevate the character to a totally different level as well. And so they reached out to me because they had seen my work before, and we kind of together worked on how essentially we could realize this. So I want to share a couple of sketches. Those are like drawings from Philippe Pouty, the illustrator who had worked on the movie. And we kind of together looked into traditional traditional African Zulu patterns and the kind of traditional clothing what married women in the African culture would wear. And then based on that, we developed a kind of, with the digital design techniques virtually, we developed the crown for the queen. And it was most important that the design would evoke something which hadn't been seen before and could not be realized in any way with traditional craftsmanship. So the kind of digital design processes were really important in that sense. And so we had worked actually for several months on these digital design processes within the computer without even the character herself being casted yet. And once the character was casted, Angela Bassett played the role for the Queen Ramonda. It was easy essentially to adapt the designs and kind of make them fit to the actress, because the designs were essentially digital, and so could be with computational design methods adapted to the actual final forms and measurements of the queen. And so what does this allow us? Essentially, we can create an identity for a woman, which is the queen in the movie, to kind of generate a vision through design for something entirely new and yet still culturally related to the African traditions.
Wow, so interesting. Thank you so much for that. And I look forward to exploring kind of the technological digital element further. But first, I thought I would ask Professor Shafer. So speaking of cultural narratives, what are some contemporary cultural narratives that you explore in your research? And do they challenge previous conceptions of identity, of how we think, for instance, even of women in, I don't know, French society? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to start off with a quote. My second book that came out in 2016, and that's not a shameless plug, by the way, was a biography of Antonin Artaud, who was a French surrealist, amongst other things, actor, playwright, theoretician. Artaud was also institutionalized for more than a decade and the recipient of over 50 electroshock therapies. But in 1946, he wrote this. A couple years before his death, he wrote, "The civil status of the man I am, Antonin Artaud, problematically bears 4th September 1896 at 8 o'clock in the morning as his date of birth. And as place of my entry in this life, Marseille, Bouches-du-Rhône, France, 4 Rue du Jardin des Plantes, on the 4th floor. However, I object to all this. I needed more time. I mean tangible, real, verified, actual, authentic time to become the edgy and irrepressible shithead that I am." So identity was something that was pretty critical to Artaud. Who he was and who he had become and whether he actually has an identity. And it was something when I was writing the book, I didn't really have the space to explore as much as I would have liked to have been able to do that facet of him, of his own self-exploration and the fact that how he saw himself as never able to materialize his pure thoughts, to verbalize them. There's always something that obstructs it, whether it's something that's socially constructed or, as he talked about, the organs of his body. He, ruminated about the idea of a body without organs, which was something that Guattari and Deleuze ultimately stole from him. But he talked about that there's all sorts of obstructions that impede the assertion of pure thought. So I had that in the back of my mind. And then it came time to work on my next project after the Artaud book. And I'd been actually thinking about that as I'm wont to do when I'm in the middle of a project and I'm getting kind of frustrated. I start thinking about the next project because I know I can't work on it, but it's just easier than dealing with what I'm dealing with. So as I was thinking about the next project, I kind of hooked onto, I kind of got settled on a murder case, which I've got a real fascination with anyway, murder cases in general. But Anyway, it was a young woman, 20 years old, in 1923, who assassinated a proto-fascist. Her name was Germaine Berton. So we can just move to that. So Germaine Berton goes to the headquarters of the Action Française, which was a proto-fascist group. It had been around actually long before fascism. It was around in the 1890s. It started pretty much around the time of the Dreyfus affair in France. They were anti-Dreyfus because they were horribly anti-Semitic. And then we fast forward post-World War I, and she's determined to kill the head of the Action Française, whose name was Léon Daudet. He's the son of a great French author from the famous French author, I don't know if he's great, from the 19th century, Alphonse Daudet. She fails in that attempt, but she ends up killing the head of the paramilitary group associated with the Action Française, the Communaux Droit, a guy named Marius Plateau. So this young woman gets arrested, and she's someone who's anonymous in life. I mean, people don't know Germaine Berton before she kills, but then it becomes the crime of the century. And, of course, as we know, every 6 months there's a new crime of the century. And that was no different in 1920s France than it is today. So 1923, she gets arrested, and, she doesn't get it. It's a slam dunk case. She's found at the scene, the gun, literally the smoking gun is still in her hand, still smoking. She tried to kill herself, and she's arrested. She recuperates in the hospital. She's put on trial. And 11 months later, on Christmas Eve, 1923, she's found not guilty. Okay. So the case is fascinating. There's so many different aspects of it. I'd love to go on and on about it, but we absolutely do not have the time. So let me talk about identity with her. The case itself was intrinsically interesting to me. Just this whole idea of this young woman, and she is part of anarchist groups in France and is put on trial. And I want to talk about these pictures in a second. And then she's found not guilty. But I was trying to think, what is my angle on it? So this is where it connects it to Southeast Europe. So I'm in Bosnia a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and I met my partner Selma, her mom Hasha's apartment. They're watching a TV show called Ludzvunien, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Ludzvunien Normalen, Crazy Stupid Normal. And this guy, he's an actor who lives in Los Angeles now. Gerbic is the last name. I think it's Mirza Gerbic. Anyway.
Mirai Gerbic.
What's that?
Mirai Gerbic.
Mirai Gerbic, right. He's doing like a spoken word. It's a comedy. It's a sitcom. And Selma and her mom are laughing hysterically. And I don't understand really any of it. I can maybe understand about 20 words in Serbo-Croatian, and I probably memorized about 50. So, but they keep looking back at me to get my reaction. I'm like, Anyway, so Selma translates it for me. And what she said is, he just said, I'm going to tell a true story about a fictitious person. And all of a sudden I thought, wow, that's it. We are all fictitious people. None of us have an identity. None of us have a true, authentic identity, because authenticity doesn't exist. If we claim we're being true to ourselves, we're not. We're being true to the image we want to project or create of ourselves. Or else maybe that we want other people to see in us. And this is the same of Germaine Berton. So this was my hook. As I thought about it, this was a throwaway line to get the audience to laugh on this Bosnian TV show. But to me, it was a very profound thought. And it became the hook for how I'm going to analyze Germaine Berton. Let's look at these photos here. What do we see when we look at these photos? What is the contrast in these two photos from her trial? We see a young 21 at that point, 21-year-old woman. She's dressed in white. Look what she's surrounded by, all of these men. She is the only woman in that courtroom. The contrast, the sartorial contrast between Germaine Berton and the men couldn't have been greater. And it brings up the issues of gender that are just so enveloped in this case, in terms of what was expected of her, how gender factors into it, from her lawyer's defense that got her off, to the Action Française in their newspaper and how what they thought of her, to the surrealists like Artaud, who championed her cause, to the L'Humanité, the French communist newspaper, and La Libertaire, the anarchist newspaper. It's saturated with it, saturated with, a part of her being that she couldn't escape if she tried to, that she had to succumb to as a woman. And that's not the only thing. It's just the issue of identity and to me, about how individual identity is so much more important, I think, and so neglected in comparison to our fetishization of collective identity. And I don't want to take anything away from that. But as somebody who works with grad students, I got to say this, that over the years, I'm like up to here with this kind of sloppiness of grad students talking about collective identity. And what are you working on? I'm working on identity issues. Well, I mean, individual identity, I think, is where it's at. And even that is problematic. So I'm going to stop here because I've been spouting off for a long time.
No, thank you. And I think this leads us perfectly into the question of rhetoric. I think it's very interesting what you said about, identity and how individual identity is already problematic as is. And then thinking about Artaud and the question of authenticity, Professor Harrison, I know that you and I have discussed the question of authenticity several times, especially in relation to Carlo Michelstädter, one of the figures that you write about in your book 1910. So what I wanted to project is a quote by, I'm not sure if you can all see it. I will share my screen. By the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who maintained that one of the most misleading representational techniques in our language is the use of the word I. So my question is language as unstable and problematic as the identities it supports, especially thinking about individual identity, as we were just stressing the importance of first focusing on individual identity before being able to even discuss collective identity? And are the two inextricably linked? What are the challenges and perils of storytelling or narrative representation?
Well, I'm not sure that you can distinguish individual from collective identity that easily, to be honest, because you might say, oh, well, the collective identity is fraudulent, so we have to rely on the individual one. But what's the individual one based on, if not collective? It's the part in the whole hermeneutic problem. We are constantly constructed by our communities, by our cultures, by what we're taught at school, and so on and so forth. So even the individual identity is problematic, which is why Freud was invented, because the I is illusory, and it's just the tip of an iceberg, most of which is beneath sight, beneath the water. If it's not unconscious, it's certainly not fathomable. So we go around, even if we have a sense of an individual identity, thinking we know who we are, but don't forget that it's been at least 2,000 years since Socrates, the traditional inventor of Western philosophy, went to the oracle in Delphi who told him, "Gnothi se auton, know thyself. Your job is to figure out who you are." And that is the challenge and the mission of authenticity. Now, the question is well taken, because how can you be authentic if you're always running around as a constructed self? What's the real self that you're being true to? It's an irresolvable problem unless, I think, we stop thinking about authenticity as who am I, as though we possess the subjective identity to begin with. One of my favorite novelists, by the way, Robert Musil, wrote a novel called The Man Without Qualities, a brilliant work of the 20th century. And he said, every person has at least 9 identities. They have a national identity, they have a ethical identity, they have a sexual identity, they have a professional identity, the list goes on and on and on. So identity is not where we have to look for authenticity, I believe. If anything, authenticity would require that we establish a critical distance from these various selves that are being sold to us, fed to us, sort of unconsciously followed. A distance that's a distance of reflection, where we try to bring maybe coherence into the different aspects of ourselves, because law exists precisely to restrain aspects of ourselves that we might otherwise want to exercise. So it's about being in the world and figuring out at every moment who is the agent, and how does this agent muster up all of his or her past knowledge to deal with the ethical challenge in front of us. it is probably those who rely upon a fixed notion of identity who are the least authentic, in that they go to the rule book before they decide. But once the self is dismantled in the early 20th century by Freud and Wittgenstein, once we understand that the word I is just a pronoun, which shifts according to who's making the sentence, and we're not today what we were yesterday, then we have, a potential crisis. And it doesn't mean we have to throw our hands up in the air and say, okay, well, we're just going to live superficially. It means that we have to figure out how all these different I's, various I's running around, need to find some common ground and some system that seems for the most part to work better than some other ones.
So since we are on this topic, would you say that the self is always constructed, the self-identity always involves an other, or is always constructed by opposition or dialogically? This is open to everyone, but I think Professor Shafer and Professor Harrison, you might deal with this question specifically in your work. So
David, you go forward.
Oh, okay. So yes, I think that it is. I think that by definition it has to be. I think that one is influenced. There's the social identity and there's the individual identity. And yet the individual identity is still a feature of the social identity. It's a feature of wanting to fit into a certain group or be distant from a certain group, by with a certain issue or idea or supporters or something along that line. That it has to be done by reference, and reference does by its nature, I think, is something that's oppositional.
excellent. Professor Harrison, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, well, I would prefer the term relational rather than oppositional.
Relational, I'm sorry. Yeah.
And well, I mean, I'm just answering Nina, not to take issue with anything you said. I agree with what you said. Relational, dialogical, I also prefer to oppositional. It's a process. The I is constantly forming itself. It's not simply constructed. I think that gives us too many alibis. We say, okay, well, I was born in Los Angeles and this year, and it's the way I've been treated, and so on. We have a distance, whether we want it or not, from action and from ourselves. The so-called other, which we often put in a position of opposition, is part of the self. We tend, if you want to be psychological about it, to extroject, to throw out of ourselves dimensions we don't like, and we project them onto others and blame them for things that we might subconsciously consider ourselves at fault for. So yeah, there's no reality without relation. Reality is relation, I believe.
Okay, and I think this leads me to a question for Professor Koerner. So there have been many technological and digital advances in architecture and design, so the fields that you engage with, and I'm interested in how these have produced or generated new approaches to visual representation. And I think Black Panther is a great example of this, but I wanted to see if maybe you can give us your perspective on how we think of identity differently through the visual, given all of these new resources and advancements that have, occurred in recent years.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I'm actually really, again, inspired by the conversations and the things what Thomas and David just have said. I think especially because there are certain things I just noted which are totally relevant in the architectural field as well. Like, for example, the body without organs, or the kind of part-to-whole relationship. Those are things which I totally experienced through my education in Vienna for a really long time and kind of researched on as well. When I studied in Vienna around 2005 to 2009 at the University of Applied Arts, I was actually for the first time exposed to digital fabrication techniques, and it was the first time that the university had a 3D printer in their department of architecture. And we architects, we were exposed to the kind of construction, the digital construction of virtual worlds, which were imaginable, but we had no other means and methods of thinking how to reproduce them than kind of indulge with the 3D printing technology and make those ideas tangible. So although additive manufacturing exists since 30 years, it was kind of in the architecture world that we started to use this technology to output and make these models tangible for physical models, scale models. On a smaller scale, you would represent those ideas. And I thought it was fascinating that you could produce what you generated with the computer directly. You just sent a digital file and the 3D printer outputs it. And there was obviously flaws in the materials and so on, and how to bring those tangibilities back into the digital. And so the experience of studying those in Europe was kind of also influenced by the US, because I had an American, actually Californian-based professor, Greg Lynn, who really influenced me in this process. And I thought it was fascinating that you all of a sudden can produce products on a one-to-one scale without necessarily rethinking their tectonics or how to divide them into parts. And so what does this allow us? The digital methodologies allow us to think of entirely new geometries, which we with an analog way can perhaps sketch, but how do we realize them? And so the generative design, which is mostly based on mathematical formulas and algorithms, allows us to rethink and expand and evoke things which we maybe have not thought about before. And so it opens an entirely new field of visualization and character design, and may it be in architecture, where we rethink the way of how we design buildings and spaces we inhabit. I see fashion in its smallest scale, the way of how we inhabit form and structures, and how we live in those. And I think it enables us to think just differently about processes, design, and vision, therefore character, identity, and so on, and how to also establish a common ground and work internationally, because through the digital, it allows us to work cross-disciplinary globally, and we can work and collaborate with other designers and thinkers virtually. And right now we have to do everything kind of virtually. So that's just another situation where we find ourselves in.
It's fascinating to see how, individual contributions can create something that then is reflective of maybe a whole generation, or becomes kind of a collective effort to push the boundary and produce, like you said, a whole new, field of vision, or new processes, new technologies that can completely help us, challenge how we've thought of these things up until now. And this gets me thinking about this, part to whole relationship. And Professor Shafer, my question would be, since I'm always interested in questions of, history, and as a student of literature, as a literary critic, you deal with history all the time, always. So my question is, what is the difference between history with a lowercase h and history with a capital H? Do histories of particular people, or stories, or histories in plural, challenge the idea of a single grand history with a capital H, or historical narrative? I hope that question was clear.
Yeah, it is. It's a little bit of a complex question. So I think what you're referring to is when you're talking about histories in the lowercase, you're largely referring, I think, to the way in which literature delves into historical or individual voices of people, of historical people. Is that correct? Based on your own work.
Yes.
So, okay, so there's a book that I'm just finished reading, which is a really good book. It's by a Turkish author, Elif Shafak. It's called 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in This Strange World. And it tells the story of a young woman's dwindling consciousness, a woman who's been murdered, and her dwindling consciousness during the last 10 minutes, 38 seconds of her life, basically, as her mind is shutting down, I should say. The story is set against a backcloth of really major events, global events, but also big events in Turkey in the 1970s as well. And they feature kind of in the background, but they also play a really large role. And so I think the thing is that whereas a lot of historians would object to the, how would I put this? The way in which literature appropriates history. I don't have that problem. I don't have that problem if it's done well, if one understands the motivations of people at a particular time. But even then, it's always guessed. But that's what historians do too, in terms of our reconstruction of the past. It's based on sources, of course. But do sources tell the entire story? Can they tell the entire story? I don't know if there's really a grand narrative of history either. There's a larger story that historians try to tell that increasingly has individual voices in it. But I think that there's a lot that literature can do to flesh that out, to give us a sense of a period without compromising the integrity of that. Again, like as I said, I'm struggling with this issue of artificiality and phoniness. In my own work, I did a paper recently about about a year or so ago, about a year and a half ago, about the very tragic case of the musician David Berman, who took his life in August. And David and I were in regular communication before he took his life. But the paper I gave was delivered before that, and it was basically about David Berman in a world of phonies and the quest for authenticity in his lyrics and his music. And there isn't any. There isn't any. So if you're struggling with that issue, what does it matter if you create a story out of whole cloth that's based against the backcloth of the past?
Oh, very, very interesting. And I think that this is the perfect segue for my next question to Professor Harrison, which concerns reality. And since we're already talking about, individual experience and our personal narratives and how perhaps they may be different from someone else's, and then how do we, talk about collective identity if there are such disparities? My question, I will share my screen here, is a quote, refers to a quote by Luigi Pirandello, one of my favorite Italian authors. And the quote is, "Whatever is a reality today, whatever you touch and believe in, and that seems real for you today, is going to be like the reality of yesterday, an illusion tomorrow." So Pirandello is famous is very well known for tackling the issue of identity head on. And he conceived of identity, even reality, as a thoroughly illusory and fleeting notion. Do you agree with that? And where does this leave us? Is there any place left for authenticity if reality is so fragile?
I agree with it in part, and I disagree with it in part, because, literally from an intellectual, philosophical point of view, it's true. My reality today is not the same as my reality yesterday. On the other hand, there's a lot of it that is the same that I don't necessarily acknowledge or emphasize, so that, I'm like a wave. There's certain things that come up and other things that go down. I agree with David, and this, if you take Pirandello seriously, then you don't believe in history either. In fact, you don't even believe in fact at a certain point. And so we have to take his relativism with a grain of salt. It is true, but it only tells half of the story, and it leads potentially to a kind of nihilistic skepticism, whereby you feel that nothing is there's no way to evaluate the higher value of something intellectually than another. I do believe that collective identities are real insofar as they're believed in. In fact, I would correct Pirandello by his own sense of this, which probably Nietzsche shares. There is reality, but it's when illusions are believed in properly and sufficiently and deeply, then those things are real. There's nothing more real than what you're passionately committed to, even though if that's an illusion, like your wife is faithful to you, or that your country is got to take over Europe. These are illusions, but they are the realities, unfortunately, by which people operate. There's no way out of this cage except distance from it, skepticism towards it, and recognition that that ideas are just ideas and need to be weighed carefully. And there's no final solution. As I said about authenticity earlier, I don't think that it's not a eureka experience. So you wake up and you say, okay, I found myself like a Buddha. A couple of people might do it, but most will not. So yeah, I think we have little histories. I think that the distinction between history and literature is not firm. History is a form of narrative and selects which events are important and which are not. We need storytellers. We need movies. A powerful movie or a powerful novel, a powerful poem shapes minds, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. What's a bad thing is rhetorical, simplistic, dumb uses of rhetoric shaping minds. And the most innocent, naive minds are most vulnerable to that. So the risk is that popular culture will feed upon the innocent and the naive and sell images that are not particularly useful. And then you end up with a devolution of culture, which I'm afraid we've probably been experiencing for 100 years or so now, if I'm not too pessimistic.
Okay, and since we're on the topic of misrepresentation, in a sense, Professor Koerner, I was interested in hearing more about what some potential risks associated with artistic representations of cultures or visual representations of cultures are, and if you've encountered any, or if there are any, do they involve the fact that cultural contexts interpret visual elements and objects differently?
That's a really
Especially
good.
And I think this is interesting coming from you as an Austrian, who has kind of traveled all over the world and worked all over the world and engaged with so many different cultures.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, totally. I think the question touches on in an interesting part. So one thing is that I would think when I look at my work and the kind of people I've worked together with and collaborated with, they have come from many different backgrounds. And so I have experience to work both with individual artists in Europe, or companies, but also with larger companies and production companies in the entertainment industry. And so I think I would like to reference just an example also. For example, when I got invited to collaborate with Ruth E. Carter, I at the beginning had no idea what project I was actually working on. So when they approached me, they did not tell me what movie it was for or in which way the character's role eventually would be. All I knew was it was a movie about Africa and technology. And I started to ask myself, well, if I design the costumes for one of the main characters, what does that essentially mean? And how right or wrong can that turn out? And what type of movie is this? And they had code names, everything top secret. And so you start working on a project where you don't really know what the kind of implications are, and it's crucial to kind of, you ask yourself, what is this actually? And so luckily my experiences have turned out in the most incredible way ever, because when I then learned that this was for Black Panther and Marvel, at the beginning I also didn't really quite know what that actually meant. But when in 2018 all the pre-sale was sold out entirely, I realized what I got myself literally into. And then when it became the most successful film of 2018 and was nominated for 8 Oscars, and at the end won 3 Oscars, one in Best Costume Design, it kind of literally blew my mind. And it was really exciting to be part of the team and work with them and have such a great experience on the first movie I've actually worked on. So it can turn out in its best way. I had other experiences also where it turned out also great, but essentially not in a way that I would have thought so either. So as you go along and as you grow, and those are all projects which are, let's say, for the first time, you have to be quite radical to kind of say yes to, as an architect and designer, to all in a sudden work on a costume design where you haven't really worked on that before. So there's a certain risk associated to it, right? But I think that's maybe also something of my Austrian natural, to kind of be ready to expose myself to challenges and to try out new things and to engage with those. And you learn by doing, you grow by each project, and nowadays I think much different when I engage with any kind of movie, because I know how things can turn out or perhaps not. So I think it's really crucial that you think about what are you producing, and that you're aware that the audience can grow as well. It's very different whether you design for a haute couture show, which maybe only a small amount of people can see, or whether you design something for a movie which has a global reach, which is unexpected. So that taught me essentially that any project which comes up can turn out to be a total failure or a super success. And so you have to be conscious in how you design for those moments, and make sure that you always go to it with authenticity, in that sense that you deal with it authentically. So I'm always trying to stay true to myself, and with whatever work I engage with, I try to be authentic to myself, so that it limits the risks in a way.
Thank you so much for this very interesting answer. And lastly, I think I will just ask Professor Harrison and Professor Shafer if they would like to add on to that, perhaps from a literary and historical perspective, about some of the risks associated with literary or historical representations of cultures. And I think that we have about 2 to 3 minutes. So if you'd like to speak to that, if you have anything in mind. I think you're muted, Professor Harrison.
I would just like to say that
I keep making that mistake, but I wanted to show that clip of Fellini, if it's possible, if nobody minds. It's not perfectly relevant to what Julia was saying, but I think it is insofar as it's a critique of sort of identities that one takes on because comedy exists to unmask and expose. So there was, Nina, also just a clip. There was some 5 professors or teachers. I don't know if they're there.
I think this is it. This is the only one I have, or perhaps I can try to find it.
No, well, that's okay. Right above it, you see the slide above that?
Oh yeah, so just the slides, the stills.
This is the setup. Okay, so
Okay,
this will take a minute. So in Fellini's Amarcord, by the way, the reason I bring him up is because if he were alive, he would have been 100 years old today. He was born in 1920. And so in Amarcord, the comedy, one of the priceless sequences is a 7-minute long sequence in the high school where these different professors are doing their classes. So on the top left, you have the professor of history. And in the middle, you've got the professor of mathematics, who happened to be somebody that was famous in the town of Rimini, where Fellini grew up. You see, she's buxom, and so she's sexual, but also very intimidating. And then you've got on the right, the professor of philosophy, doing some Hegelian sort of gentile and fascist stuff. The art historian on the bottom, teaching Giotto. And then the science professor on the bottom right. The one I wanted to show you, because it's just priceless, is the professor of Greek. And to set it up, I would say this, that this person, although he's a caricature, is totally impassioned with his subject matter. He loves ancient Greek. He is completely enamored with his own mask and his own persona. So he doesn't even understand at the beginning that these boys have no use for him and that they're making fun of him. So the encounter, to talk about dialogics and relationship of a self and another, is something that I think is very therapeutic to always remember, and not to take ourselves too seriously and to get lost inside our mask or persona as this professor does. So if you don't mind playing that clip, we can have a little laugh.
Äptane kron garpesonton, ysse marpsamen posin, keilioi enimen fones. Bella la lingua greca, vero?
Ostia.
Come musicale, eh? E marpsamen, ripeti.
Marpsa?
No. Silenzio.
Non riesco.
State un po' zitti voi altri. Coraggio, ripeti.
Professore, può essere così gentile?
Dimmi, caro, che vuoi?
Scusi, me lo potrebbe far risentire?
Certo. Guarda. E marpsamen. Fai attenzione alla lingua. Deve battere qui contro il palato, così. E poi cacciala fuori. E marpsamen. Coraggio. E
marpsa?
No. Silenzio. Dunque, coraggio, su.
Marpsa? Hai sentito? È difficile il greco. Come la metteva la lingua?
Non così fuori, tra i denti.
Così?
Dai, oh, che ci sei vicino.
Questo è giusto. E mar...
Quasi riuscito, però.
I'm not sure if you were able to hear that.
It doesn't quite work stuttering like that, but anyway, the idea gets across, I think.
Perfect.
I think we're out of time, that we need to move to the questions and answers. And I think there is one question that I would like to address because somebody asked what this all has to do with Southeast Europe. And I think that we have been exploring for several years through this format, because we have a festival with films from 18 countries, now 20 countries sometimes. And in almost all cases, these films are an ensemble of different people and different artists who work on these movies who are not necessarily from the region. And the themes are revolving around authenticity, history, identity, belonging, and the very blurred boundaries between languages, cultures, countries. Everything is really fluid. Nobody's really sure of, talking about facts in this particular region. So what we are trying to do with this type of companion program is to shed the light on what is behind the artistic endeavor of our filmmakers and also writers, because you have a whole new generation of writers that are writing now about their experiences in 2, 3, 4 different cultures or languages. So we are interested in the substance of identity and these boundaries and how art pushes these boundaries. And I think the art is the only way how we can understand where a lot of these stories are coming from and what are they motivated by. So that is the reason that we like to explore in depth some of these topics, and that is why I think that it is a very crucial endeavor for us to engage people who are historians, who are studying and probing these questions, and also people like Julia, who are artists and who can shed the light on the process of creating art, creating something that she comes from our part of the world, but she lives and works here in Hollywood. And then she creates something that is, for a film, that's nothing to do with our region. However, it's nothing to do with the planet. It's a different planet altogether. So it's constructing a whole new world. It's an imagined world, not a real world. And sometimes art is about that, about something that doesn't really exist. So I think that this type of a conversation is important because it gives us that other half of the story that we try to say every year through 50, 60 films that we bring that are very diverse, come from very different backgrounds. And it's true that history is the context that sometimes is very, people feel as shackles on their identity, and they like to break out of those historical shackles. And the same thing goes for language. And I know that Nina in particular maybe can spend a couple of minutes to tell us about her research in I hesitate to use the word minority, cultures and literary traditions, but how does one maintain certain cultural identity, living and working in a different country? So these are the questions that we ask, and we try to find some interesting answers that go all across, and that's why we are very keen on continuing these conversations to probe into these issues a little bit deeper than just through the movies. So if you can, Nina, just tell us a few words about what you are researching, what motivates you, and then we can move on to some other questions that we have.
So my research concerns, my cultural focus is Trieste, the northeastern Italian city. And the issues that I tackle are not limited to Trieste, but I find that Trieste is the perfect place for the exploration of these questions of identity and belonging and the self versus the other, or the self as other. What I'm interested in is how such a peripheral city and interstitial city in Europe, it occupies a very unique position in Europe. It is an intersection of cultures, of languages, of traditions, but also tensions. Trieste has a very difficult past, and as such, it is home to many different authors who tackle these questions from different perspectives. And so my dissertation that I'm currently working on is entitled Rethinking the Triestine Other and Negotiating Alterity in the works of Claudio Magris, Boris Pahor, Giuliana Morandini, and Giorgio Pressburger. So what I'm interested in is how collective identity is tackled through minority identities. So perspectives that usually don't receive the attention that they merit. For instance, Boris Pahor, who is a Slovenian Jew. He was born in Trieste in 1913, and he is actually 106. He is still alive and doing well today. I visited him last summer. So when he was 7 years old, Trieste fell into the hands of Benito. Well, didn't fall into the hands of it. It became a part of Italy in 1920. So after World War I, and with the rise of Mussolini with the rise of fascism, Slovenes in Italy, in Trieste specifically, were forced to assimilate to Italian culture. And so I saw one of the questions in the Q&A asks about this, about, I believe if I can find it, the Italianization of Slovene names in inner ward Trieste. So he is a very interesting figure because he's very polemical, very political, and he tackles these issues fiercely. He's a fierce advocate of, you know, the importance of cultural boundaries to preserve minority rights, whereas other authors that I deal with kind of push for a more transcendent understanding of identity, where they show that if we focus on borders and on establishing our differences too much and protecting them too much, we may not be open and respectful of others, of you know, of diversity itself. So that is why I'm very happy that SEEFest exists, and that it shows so many different perspectives, and even from you know, countries like Slovenia. I never thought I would be watching Slovene movies in LA, but I'm essentially interested in that. And Professor Harrison is actually the one who pointed me in this direction years ago, when I hadn't even really explored the works of Boris Pahor. And I think it's important for people to take an interest in minor figures, what we call minor figures, but actually I think the periphery is becoming more and more important and more central to issues of to discussions of identity and questions of identity. So I hope that summarizes what I work on.
Thank you. Well, I think that we have a couple of questions. So shall we go by some questions and see that maybe we have some answers to them? So Nina, how about that we, and by the way, I just want to say that, you know, we are working on moving the festival online. We will have some interesting films, including a wonderful documentary about a Slovenian poet, Tomáš Šalamun, who, when he writes poetry, he writes equally about the Bodhisattva and Armenia and his Slovenian, you know, background. So a lot of people from our region do not belong just to that one particular geographical location. Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Mazeno Alali. Does pure identity exist today within our so-called digital communities? Isn't music, literature, design, and other expressions of the collective culture all coming to a somewhat of an accepted global norm? So who would like to tackle this? Julia?
I think, yeah, I would like to answer this. Hello, Mazen. Nice to see that you're on the today's event. So I think that on the one hand, I would say yes, that there is a kind of globalization in identity in all these fields, in music, literature, design, and also the expression of culture. So I think that there's a certain norm, but I think identity is then mostly received or created when you kind of manage to stand out of it in a way, like when you challenge what is the norm. And I think that I personally, and I answer this question now really personally, I think the people who for me have showcase the most identity is when they have a very unique approach towards tackling any of those subjects. So I generally feel the most kind of affected or turned towards by artists or musicians who stand out of the norm and showcase their identity through their character and authenticity. And then I think that also applies for kind of the digital realm in a sense. So I think that, and maybe some of the other people want to add on that, but that's my personal feeling, that identity is then created when you manage to kind of showcase something which is very personal or to your character, or show an authentic way of creation.
We also have a question: how do you define authenticity? How would one, let's say in a digital world today, where we can manufacture our identity very easily, how do we stay, or do we even want to thrive to be authentic? And we talked about this a little bit last year when we had a conversation about audacity and authenticity. That I think that, you know, in a world where it's so much is around us in a digital arena, how do we assert ourselves as authentic presence, or does it even matter? Or we can be playful about it. We can be just very playful with the identity.
I don't think you can. I think that by nature of the digital age, it's all farce. It's all it's all contrivance. I'm sorry if
No, please.
I feel it's all contrivance. It's about getting attention. That's the motivation largely today. And so getting attention involves a calculation. The calculation of what's going to resonate, what's going to offend, what's going to cause people to gravitate towards you. And when you do that, I think that the gulf between, you know, who you might have been, but who you have become, becomes unbridgeable.
I think, can I add on to that briefly? I think, for instance, thinking about social media and Instagram, since I am, you know, part of this digital generation, and we do like our social media. So I think true authenticity, and I've talked with my students about this, is kind of resisting or overcoming the narcissistic impulse that drives our behavior online. So the likes, the comments, and wanting to, you know, appear and wanting to be recognized. And so I think the way that you can also find authenticity in the way that you engage with social media is by recognizing that it is not a wholesome portrayal of yourself, of your identity, of your interests, and of your passions. So I think that sometimes people take social media a little bit too seriously, where they almost believe that it is an alternative, like an alternate almost representation of them. But I think we transcend that. So I think when we recognize that, I think that is where we are engaging with it in an authentic way. I'm not sure that an authentic self truly appears on social media. So it's just me.
We have a question from Kathleen Jordan. In sorting out the many selves and reflecting on them, is there not a point where one arrives at the threads of an essential self involving some continuity? And how does this involve the future projections of this essential self in the communities we encounter?
I'm not sure I understood the question, to be honest.
I'm not going to help you there with that one, so I am not sure. She might want to elaborate a little bit for us.
I think I understand it. If I'm so when we think about, I think this is kind of a Pirandellian. It refers to the Pirandellian notion of, you know, the social constructs that we create and the masks that we create for ourselves and wear according to different environments and contexts. And so, but isn't there one essential self that involves some continuity, in the sense that isn't there a true self, a true I that continues, or are we just this endless sequence of masks? I think that is essentially what it's asking. If I'm not wrong, I'm not sure. Maybe Kathleen can confirm, or.
Well, we shall nothing so far. So we have Denny, who is asking, Denny Dougali, thank you for this wonderful salon. My question is for Julia. Your work is gorgeous, and I'm very familiar with the work of Iris van Herpen and Ruth Carter. I'm a production designer in film and TV, and a trained architect as well. I love the part of the design process that centers around inspiration. What moves you, and do you like the collaborative part of the process, or does it limit your imagination?
Thanks for the great question, and hi, Danny. So for my personal work, I find my inspiration in nature. So I'm inspired by the beauty of natural organisms, may it be reliefs, patterns, or any kind of things I find in nature. And I love to kind of abstract those mathematical logics of natural elements and then translate them in the most synthetic way in the digital computational design in the computer, and in essence also use synthetic production methods to output those. So I find inspiration when I go outside and just find things or read through books or see something interesting. And that motivates me also, the kind of the creation part in it. When I do work with other designers and collaborators, there's various different things which inspire us. But for example, with Ruth Carter, it was mostly the illustrations of African patterns which we looked at, and how to kind of look at this very old and ancient traditional graphical elements and how to translate those with most innovative novel techniques. And I think that every collaboration is different. I think that some collaborations open your mind entirely and make you think about something totally new, and others they are limiting yourself. So one of the limitations, for example, I thought was in some of the working with some fashion designers was that they are more interested in the kind of showcasing of the piece or the effect what it has, rather than the material logics within it. And so that's a personal thing which I like to explore now in my own pieces much more, is how does materials perform? Are there certain biomaterials we can work with? Are there new techniques we can rethink how we produce things in today's world? And what does local production essentially mean for fashion design? And how can we utilize such novel technologies in the most innovative way, which rethink the way of how we thought about making fashion before, and what kind of new opportunities does it allow us to do, both for sustainability and environmental impact as well.
Thank you. We have, I think, a question for both David and Tom from Mark Hayes. How does national identity coexist with world identity? How does one strike the proper balance?
It depends on what the balance is, what the proper balance is. I'm thinking back to early Christianity, where the message of early Christianity was beyond nations. The world identity was what every self was. And ultimately that has to take precedence over national identity. Even Pope Francis today is saying the same thing. You have both. Just as I said, you have a sexual identity and a local identity, and you've got all of these identities. You do have to strike a balance between them. You have to coordinate them. Sometimes one will take precedence over another. If your country is in big trouble, it's being invaded, then your national identity will rise above the world identity. If you're with a virus like ours, it may be that the world identity should be more important. I don't think there's a balance. These, many of these things we're talking about so theoretically are all solved in practical situations, including, the one that the Q&A started with. What does it have to do with Southeastern Europe? Well, everything has to do with Southeastern Europe. And Southeastern Europe has to do with everything too. So theory and practice go together. And it's not, it would be a mistake to think that Southeastern Europe is different from Northeastern Europe and Western Europe and so on. Then we go back to the boxes that we're trying to question through theory and philosophy and dialogue. So once we know that national identity needs to be balanced with world identity, we're more than half the way there.
I will just, yes, David, please.
I'm just going to say ever so briefly, thank you, Mark, for the question. I think that the ideal is to have a more universal global identity, to be able to have that sense of empathy and to be able to relate to different peoples. But unfortunately, the refuge becomes national identity, and that unfortunately becomes most of our frames of reference, a certain parochialism. And we could discuss that further with regard to Southeast Europe, but I think that's my answer.
I would just like to mention, it is related, I think, that one of the best books I've ever read about the recent history in former Yugoslavia, for example, is a book that was written by a Scottish Sierra Leone writer. She was born in Sierra Leone. She lives in Scotland. Her name is Aminata Forna. The book is The Hired Hand, and it's about an English woman who goes for some reason to Croatia after the war of the 90s, and she hires a local man to remodel the house that she rented. And through living there and through this man, she slowly unravels and discovers the layers of what happened in the past. So it is one of the most profound books, and written by somebody who is not from there, who is not even from Europe originally, but who went for the crux of the matter, what was going on, and found a way, and in my view, struck a really great balance when she wrote about this. So Aminata Forna, a wonderful writer, otherwise, with several other amazing books, but that one is in particular about something that is totally related to our region. And I just wanted to mention her because the book is right there with, the best of them, really. So we do, cross these boundaries in art as well, not just in identity, but, art is, I think, really the way for us to travel more freely. Let's see, do we have any more questions? We have a question from James Rosen. Speaking of origins and identity, I'm reminded of the film Fratelli Taviani, film Chaos, based on Pirandello stories, in the final segment of which a grieving son is consoled by his deceased mother, who tells him, "Non piangere per me, piangi per te stesso." I don't speak Italian, I'm sorry. "Don't cry for me, cry for yourself." Comments regarding how this relates to past and present more generally in history and in literature.
Well,
Nina?
it's Nina, probably Nina on this one.
No, I think Professor Harrison, you can start since you're the Pirandello expert, and I will add on. But
well, yeah, I don't know how to put anything in a nutshell concerning that final scene of an episode, because the movie fictionalizes stories of Pirandello, adapts them into cinema, and one of them that James is referring to here is when the author Pirandello has an imagined dialogue with his mother, who asks him not to grieve her, to grieve for yourself, because I think the same reason that he's grieving her, namely that there's a loss of who you are, that all things come to pass, and that we've got to put ourselves into the quotient, right? Not to other the problem by put it on the other side of a border, so it's the mother who dies or someone else who dies and not me, but to always identify oneself with what's outside there. That's probably the best I could do with it.
I think what the only thing I would really add is when she says "Non piangere per me, piangi per te stesso." I guess you could say that our understanding of self is contingent on our relationships with others, right? We understand who we are in relation to how we engage with others, who surrounds us, who helps us understand who we are. So I think maybe that's how I would interpret it. And I think the present is inextricably linked to the past. I think we're constantly thinking about the past as we move forward in the present, and when we think about the future, change, instability. I think these things make us constantly question who we are in relation to the world.
Can I just add to what Nina just said as well? And this takes us back to the very first question that Nina asked me, which is that to me it sounds, not being a Pirandello expert by any stretch, but I would say that it sounds like it's the legitimization of the past of the present by reference to the past, that it provides a sense of legitimacy by reference. One would think that the character could have come up with that on his own, but instead he puts it in the mouth of his deceased mother.
I'm not sure. We have a couple of questions from Thomas McDonald. Nina, thank you. What do you make of Haver's and later Handke's reference back to Kosovo? And also, what happens to national, I guess, literary departments and languages in the ideal, quote unquote, ideal global world?
Well, thinking of Kosovo, I think intertextuality, for instance, for Pahor is very, very important, and he makes so many folk references. And in Trieste, really helps Triestine Italians to kind of engage with Slovenian culture and literature in a different way. So he's almost using this platform that he fought so hard for. You know, writing in Italian Trieste, in Slovenian, as a way to hang on to his Slovenian roots, even though at the age of 7 he was forced to, you know, to become Italian and not given the opportunity to speak his native language in public or in school. He kept learning Slovenian up in the mountains secretly, so almost a form of rebellion. I think it's important to reference these important figures in Slovenian literature and Slovenian, you know, literary and artistic traditions, and I think that it's a very wise thing to do, and he's very passionate about that, you know, about celebrating the diversity that one can find even in Slovenian literature. So that would be my answer.
Tom, do you want to get back to the Kathleen Jordan's question, maybe just to add something to it, because I see your comments here?
Well, no, I just didn't realize, because Kathy Jordan, I have to say, is a teacher of mine, one of my favorite and most dear friends in the world, whom I haven't spoken to for maybe 50 years. That's how she was my high school teacher. And I didn't realize that one of those questions that I didn't understand was hers. But I think it's been answered. It was the one about how, you know, isn't there some essential self ultimately that does connect to communal selves? And I think there is. There is continuity in our behavior. We're not totally contradictory, fragmented, and irrational. You know, there's something there that there's a thread that gets tied. Now, it might get untied. You can get divorced. You can have deaths. And there are, you know, it's in process, as I mentioned, and it connects with collectivities all the time. They're not always the same one and all, which is why the question that we haven't answered, that was asked about how do you do national literatures in a global world, is a real problem, because if your collectivity is Southeastern Europe or Northwestern Europe or heterosexual males or whatever it may be, if you're stuck in that within those boundaries, then you're not really living fully or flexibly, or, you know, you're not, quote, authentic insofar as you're not fully alive. You're just kind of what you have accepted to be. So you form allegiances, I hope, all the time, and some disappoint you and some develop into more sophisticated ones. And we negotiate it all, I think, in the end.
Thank you. I would like to ask everybody to maybe for the final comment, and starting with you, Julia, where is the inspiration coming from? Where are the major influences? Map out for us things you really love. It doesn't have to be related to the topic, but what really moves you and, you know, propels you to create something that, you know, that spark that everybody gets when they start writing a book, or like what David was describing, you know, how things came together and sort of, you know, coalesced when he was watching a show that had nothing to do with France. And for you, Julia, that you come from one specific tradition, and then you translate that into a different maybe medium, or experiment with certain things. So where is your inspiration, and where are the influences coming from for each one of you?
Yeah, I think I answered this a little bit before already when I referred to kind of my inspirations from nature, essentially. But I think what really that this has maybe to do also with the way of how I grew up, because my mother, she's a biologist, and my father is an arts and crafts professor in high school and university. And so I grew up in this kind of world of looking both at biology and craftsmanship, and the way of how those two kind of work together, both through materials, aesthetics, and kind of beauty. And I think what really struck me was that I was also always really interested in fashion. And for some time I wanted to become a fashion designer, but architecture was always my first choice as well. And I think I would have little known that one day I would come back to it was almost like naturally that I would now work in a world of fashion, because that was something I really always wanted to, but I know that I would probably work in it in a very traditional way, wouldn't I have not studied architecture. So for me, this kind of way, there's an Austrian saying, über den Tellerrand hinausschauen, so to look outside of the plate, or to look beyond the border, so what's beyond what we are knowing. That's something which really evokes me to do something new and to motivate me to think outside of the box. So I guess that's also something I teach my students every day at UCLA, is how can you think outside of what you know, and how can you challenge yourself? And that I guess that inspires me to work in that way.
The same saying exists in Croatia, and there was a movie recently that premiered, I think, in Venice, Don't Look in My Plate, or, Stop Looking at My Plate. So this goes to show how, cultures really are closer than we think. So how about Nina? Where's your inspiration, influences?
My inspiration one of my influences is Professor Harrison. I was an undergraduate student at UCLA, and then I just continued on and got my MA, and I'm now working on finishing up my doctorate. But I think I truly just see so much richness in literature, and what motivates me is to help my students see that, to help students think critically about the world, not only to answer questions, but also to learn how to ask questions, to be curious, to see interconnections, to form interconnections between different cultural contexts, different languages. And I think literature really just, it allows me to travel to different parts of the world, to be exposed to so many different perspectives, and to really look, inside and think introspectively. I think as a person who has a very hybrid identity, I've always struggled to really understand who I am. How do I fit into these different categories? And I think literature has allowed me to understand that it's okay to transcend them, and to not necessarily rely on rhetoric to, I guess, establish my identity, but rather to explore it. So to explore it rhetorically instead of trying to, create it or establish it, I would say. So I owe a lot of that to Professor Harrison, and yeah, so that's how I would say.
David?
So as a historian, I think what motivates me, and this is going to sound like a completely ironic what I've been saying, but what's in my core, because I think what I've been saying all along, for those of you who are still listening, is that we don't really have a core. We have a manufactured core. But the point is, what I try to look for is little stories in history, little stories that tell a bigger story about a society. And my area of research is France. That doesn't mean that I'm completely consumed with national histories. I'm really not. It's just the convenience of the discipline. But I look for little stories. The little story of Jamin Berton, which was a big story in 1923, but has faded from people's historical knowledge. My next project, which is Hollywood scandals of the 1920s, how they resonated in France. It's basically finding little things like that. It's not, for me, it's not grabbing onto what other historians have done. You know, when I started working on the Artaud book, I had a friend from France, a close friend of mine who's a historian. He's French. He's now at Cambridge. And he said to me, oh, you're working on Artaud. He said, so you're no longer a historian. You're more of a studies person now, French studies. Well, yeah, okay, fine. Fair enough. I'll take that. But that's the whole thing. It's essentially finding connections with these little stories that tell a bigger story about the past and maybe something larger about the human condition.
Tom?
Well, I've got to take Nina's lead and follow it up by saying that, believe it or not, I really have to thank Kathy Jordan, who was my high school teacher in a wonderful high school that got me thinking about things that I didn't really want to think about. And she, I remember, not forced me, but really very staunchly said, I have to commit to issues that matter. At the time, we were talking about Black Panthers, and it was a period of immense upheaval in Europe and in the United States. And I would have been happy to play my flute and take pictures. And she made me understand that that wasn't enough. And also, like Nina, I had a very multicultural upbringing. My father was American. My mother was Italian. I was born in Turkey. We moved then to Rome. We spoke French. We went to French schools at the beginning. I mean, the whole thing was a mess. It was a total mess. It was worse than the Balkans. Forget about the Balkans. Okay. So what's the problem that puts in front of you? You have to make sense of it all. And you know that a single identity is a nonsense, not only an illusion, but a disservice to yourself and to all of those who think that they are Turkish or think that they are Italian. It's ridiculous. So thank God for multiculturalism, which is the climate I grew up in. And thank God for good schools. I can't stress this enough. And good teachers like Kathy Jordan, who get people thinking. I'm afraid that if you haven't gotten thinking by age 16 or 17, it's almost too late. University's too late. So I'm just fascinated by problems, to be very honest. I like to write, but I only like to write when I have something to solve. And I'd like to invent something. I like to invent myself, if you will, although I don't dare do so. But I like to create something new. It's a creative process. So if we don't have anything new to create, then we may as well pack it in, you know? Life would be very boring.
Well, on that note, we do our part in trying to make life a little bit less boring and more interesting, thanks to you. I really want to thank all of you. You were wonderful and engaging, and I, for one, will definitely be watching the recording to just, absorb more what you were saying and also the references that you made, because that is, I think, an inspiration for all of us who were listening to read somebody that we have not been introduced to before, to explore and research some writers or movies or influences. So thank you very much for giving us that gift tonight. I really thank you on behalf of our team, our board of directors, our volunteers. Thank you for joining us, for giving us the time, and for giving us so much to think about. And of course, thanks to our Denise for hosting this event online. And if you don't have any other final thoughts, I think we have taken a lot of your time. And any final thoughts by anybody?
I'd like
Thank
to
you
just
so much.
turn it back to you, to thank you, Vera, for bringing us together and for doing this kind of salon in which ideas can be exchanged, extemporaneously and spontaneously and with some commitment and make us all think. You're the maître à penser behind it all, so thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Julia, David, Tom, Mina, Denise, and thank you to our attendees, participants, and thank you for your questions and for staying with us and challenging us to think about these other topics outside maybe of what we discussed tonight. So to be continued, and follow us, and we will start thinking about the next one. So thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.